So I used the Pixel 2 in the beginning of this year. I'm using the Pixel 3 as of now, and even though a lot has changed, there's still one thing in common, and that is the perspective you look at it from. There are mainly two, first being Pixel the phone itself, and second being Pixel the camera. My take on Pixel the phone is coming up in a few days, so this is all about Pixel the camera. Now, I very vividly remember this iPhone 5s review of MKBHD from 5 years ago, where he judged its camera on the basis of quality and control, which basically includes everything. So let's start with the camera's control in the Pixel 3. Firstly, you can double press the power button to jump directly to it, and once you do, you find a bunch of shooting modes at the bottom and a bunch of options at the top. Most important of them being HDR+, basically a fancier name for HDR, and the second being RAW, both of which are disabled by default. Now, there are two options in HDR. First is the regular HDR, and the other one is the HDR+ Enhanced. I pretty much always used the Enhanced, but one thing that I noticed with Enhanced was the time it took to capture an image. It was almost a second, and even after capturing the image, you could find it processing in the post. Now, if you turn that off, there is practically no shutter lag. So is it worth it? If you look at this image carefully, you find not just the pole and the roof, but also some trees in the background. This was shot with the HDR turned off. When I turned on the HDR, that's what I got. The trees are the biggest differentiating factor, but surprisingly the roof got a bit dark. This second example is the one where it didn't do much. So this shot of an electricity pole that we have everywhere in India is while HDR is turned off, and this is with Enhanced turned on. It did brighten up the building a little bit, but nothing to the trees or pole itself. Also, it does feel as if the white balance has changed, which is a bit weird. This last example is by far the best one in my opinion, and it's a simple shot with the building against the sky. This is with Enhanced turned on. I think it's a pretty massive difference. Now, even if you have a slight knowledge of photography or just phone photography in general, you could capture some really breathtaking shots. If you don't, then you just need to do two things. First, watch my tips and tricks video on phone photography that I did a couple of months ago. And second, just join a photography course on the web itself on Skillshare, which although is super affordable at about $10 for a monthly membership, but the first 500 of you to click on that link in the description get the first 2 months on Skillshare completely free. You can actually find really specific and to the point courses that are just right for you and maybe also help you achieve your New Year goals. I think this mobile photography class by Joe can be a great start to develop some skills and gain the fundamental knowledge that will help you take amazing photographs from your phone's camera. Linked below. But talking about that camera, the sensor is a 12 megapixel sensor from Sony, and the lens is 28mm wide with an aperture of 1.8. You know, the usual setup. But fun fact, the sensor used, which is a Sony IMX363, is the same sensor that is used in the Zenfone 5Z by Asus, the Vivo Nex, and even the legendary Poco F1. So it is clearly evident the reason why the images from the Pixel turn out the way they do is the software, the processing, the post-processing, which for the most part is consistent. The images always have adequate saturation, great really appealing contrast, fairly consistent dynamic range as you saw, less noise indoors and low light, and amazing detail always. Now, I'm pretty sure you would have heard this a million times, but the iPhone produces more real-life images. But I always prefer the Pixel's camera more than the iPhone's because I don't really use my phone's camera a lot. So when I do, I really want the images to look good without any further editing. I honestly don't care about whether the images look more real to life. I care about whether those images are looking great to my eyes because at the end of the day, I am just an average consumer. Also, there are some other software features in the camera which really shine, like first, the portrait mode. This, unlike that of the iPhone XR, also works with inhuman objects, in fact really well. Plus, a lot of people don't really know about this, but you can also adjust the amount of bokeh in the background just like you can with the iPhone. But talking about that quality, that edge detection is so superior than any other smartphone that I just went ahead and compared it with a portrait shot from my A7 III. And to the naked eye, there's basically no difference. But of course, if you zoom in, you can totally find more detail in the shot from the A7 III. But surprisingly, they don't differ in edge detection. The A7 III, being a regular camera, produces a natural bokeh, which means it blurs out the objects further away from the camera more. The Pixel does try to mimic that, but I guess that's the only area where it needs to improve. Second, there is focus tracking now. and it works really well. I actually tried to break it by constantly moving and shaking the phone, but it would always recapture and relock the focus on the chosen subject, which is really impressive. Then there is super red zoom, which kinda does nothing. I personally found the digital zoom to be better on the iPhone XR, which also does not have a telephoto lens. But most importantly, there is night sight, which is perhaps the coolest feature of not just Pixel the camera, but also Pixel the phone in my opinion. Now, my first ever shot with it blowed me away. There was literally a night and day difference, and since then it really has produced some absolutely mind-blowing results, like this ladder one, which was completely dark initially. But the only problem that I have with this is the lack of consistency. So firstly, a lot of times it didn't work in completely dark situations which have absolutely no source of light. But even in other situations where there is some source of light, it sometimes struggled in focusing and captured images that were either completely out of focus or were focusing on some other area. Sometimes in dark conditions, it just didn't do anything and reproduced the same shot that I would have got otherwise. But when it works, it brings a drastic change in the lighting of the images. So much so that it sometimes feels there is literally a light box placed behind the subject. And in case you didn't know, it also works for front-facing cameras, which by the way have witnessed the biggest physical change. So now there is a second camera with the wider lens attached to it, which has a 107-degree field of view, and it's a lot of fun. If you get this from the primary lens, then you get this from the wider lens. I didn't notice any major distortion, but I did notice that it smoothened out my skin a bit, but it still manages to be the best selfie camera on any smartphone. Lastly, there is video. For some reason, the video does not have that appealing contrast. The colors appear really dull and washed out. The microphone is also kinda trash. It does have incredible stabilization, but the iPhone simply captures better video. So that is the camera of the Pixel. It's kind of funny if you think about it. This came in at a point when smartphone cameras were already so good, and this just took another leap in itself. So stick around for the next video, which will be all about the second perspective, that is Pixel the phone. Take care.